Good morning, and nice to meet you, Nick. So can you start by introducing yourself, and maybe in general say a few words about Center for Open Science and Open Science Framework?
Yeah, totally. So my name is Dr. Nick Fox. I had my degree in social psychology, and before that was in biochemistry and immunology. I've been at the Center for Open Science since February 2019. The Center for Open Science is a nonprofit tech startup. Our main product is the Open Science Framework, which is a collaborative tool to encourage the sharing of data and kind of collaborations between scientists. We also have other offers as well. We work a lot with pre-registration forms, and we host preprints, so publications before their peer review and publication in journals. And Center for Open Science has been around since 2013, and we're really kind of hitting our stride and seeing lots of people using our services, which has been really awesome for open science.
Yeah, so sounds good. I actually got my account in 2014. On the
Nice.
website.
One of the first.
Yeah, I feel like, when you got one of those collector numbers of a limited series kind of feeling, so it's pretty nice. Anyway, so can you tell us a bit more about how you can use, well, mostly open science framework, I guess, depending on like whether you're in the general audience, a researcher, an editor, kind of different roles in the scientific field.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different ways to use the open science framework. It's really flexible and can be used like as a light touch, like here's the place where I store my data in between collecting and writing it up, to kind of an all-in-one project management tool. I kind of started off in the former and now I've wound up in the latter, right? So as a graduate student, it would just be a place where, as I collect data, I used to work with animals. And so I would have spreadsheets of behavior and I would save those spreadsheets on an open science framework project. Authors can have as many projects as they like. And the nice thing about projects on the OSF is that they can have kind of sub projects within them and sub projects within those. It's like very, very flexible. So for instance, you could set up a project for a paper, right? And let's say all your lit review materials can be in one component, your data collection can be in another, maybe your manuscript drafts are in a third. And then let's say, oh, I have the opportunity to work with someone new who's really plugged into this area. I could then share that with them. I can add them as a collaborator, and now they have access to all those materials as well. Another great thing is then once you publish your paper in a journal somewhere, in that manuscript, you can put a link and say, here are where all the data and materials are. So any other future reader can go and find them. The cool thing about Open Science Framework is we have, and at COS in general, we have plans for long-term sustainability of all of these projects. So there is very low to no risk of 50 years down the road, you click a link and it's broken, right? So I'm sure if you've ever tried to contact a corresponding author, most of the time it gets bounced or I'm no longer at that institute. And that's a problem. And so one good thing that we planned for explicitly is that the materials that are shared and the links that are provided are long lasting. And so you can check out a paper from 2014, one of the first few that have open science framework links, they'll still be there, which is a great kind of foundation for sharing science and kind of building trust, right? It's not flash in the pan kind of project. It is a long-term sustainable data sharing project.
Yeah, I mean, as that's someone I'm gonna mention in the course, there are very trivial reasons that I disappear, and some of it are just you're not able to have the same email address because they're
Mm-hmm.
institutional for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes across as like a very important part of data sharing.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, I used to work in a lab where they were around for a long time, and in their storage area, this was a bio lab. In one of their storage areas, they kept just uh, zip drives because in the late 90s, 2000, storing data on zip drives was a thing, right? Flash forward, no one uses zip drives, but there's critical data on those, right? So if someone asked for oh, I want to reanalyze your work from this paper in 2000. It's like you have to then dust it off and hope that it works. And so, I think the internet will be around for a long time, knock on wood, who knows? But, so having this available and having it there kind of future proofs the idea that we're going to have all of these, ancient storage devices around. And, even worse, it's like you store your things on paper, you spill your coffee on it, there it goes. And there's the basis of your paper. When you say something's true about the world, your observations, well, where's the evidence, right? It's gone. And that is kind of something that was more realistic way back when. And we're kind of shifting it towards here is the archive of the information that led to these observations and this conclusion, which I think is a step forward for science.
I mean, I can only agree. Okay, so that's definitely kind of on the author or scientist side. Are there other uses of open science framework that are for, different kind of populations?
Yeah, so one really cool way I've seen the open science framework used, and this is from my angle as a scientist, not as someone working at COS, but there are journals that are starting to use it as a platform for open review. And so a psychology journal called Metapsychology, which is a meta-science angled journal looking at kind of the science of science, they use open science framework to bring together authors and reviewers, and everything is open. So it's unblinded review. The reviewers know who the manuscript author is. The manuscript author knows who the reviewers are, and everything is done in a very collaborative and open way. And so as reviews come in, you can see them right there on your project that the journal has made for this paper submission. And so that's a really cool way to kind of put everything out in the open and say, look, this process is 100% transparent. If someone wants to come see what the path for the paper looked like from manuscript submission into acceptance or revise and resubmit or rejection or whatever, here it is, and you can see it. And I think that's great. I think it's, I think OSF has been designed for scientists first, but since it's so kind of open to different users, different people in different institutions have found use in different ways. And kind of the line that passes through all of them is transparency. And so that is really great. Some of our other kind of OSF adjacent offerings, so we offer things like OSF institutions, and this is something that's used a lot by universities and by library systems. And so this is where work associated with a certain university. So like I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey. And so like, let's say different labs and different departments, you can then search all the different work that's been done at that institute, which I think is pretty cool. Let's see. So OSF preprints is a big one. So let's say you're still a little hesitant about sharing data, that's fine. Coronavirus has really put a spotlight on the speed with which science is published, right? So preprints, which are manuscripts being kind of put out in the public before peer review, really had a light shown on it, because coronavirus is this new thing, and all these preprints came out showing all different things about coronavirus. And there's good and bad there, as we've seen with different drugs and things like that. But OSF preprints is one of the preprint services kind of out there in the forefront providing this service. So that's kind of independent of kind of the workings of science, but more at the back end, at the back of the process where the paper is ready to be published. So there's like a whole life cycle that people can use OSF and kind of the OSF adjacent offerings.
Yes, sounds awesome. Can you tell me a bit more about how OSF kind of, built itself and like what's the history behind it?
Sure. It's kind of interesting. So OSF, the product, right, the Open Science Framework was actually a project, part of a dissertation by a student at University of Virginia, Jeffrey Spies, S-P-I-E-S. And he was the graduate student of Bryant Nozick at the University of Virginia. And so there was a little bit of friction because he was a psychology student, and Bryant's a psychology professor. And this is like a kind of a computer science project. It's like, I'm going to build this, this multi-node website that will allow, the storage and sharing of information. Psychologists like to work on psychology, and so this was kind of out there. But he ran with it, Jeffrey. He ran with it, and he produced a product. And interestingly, the John Arnold Foundation, which is now Arnold Ventures, they heard about it and they offered funding to kind of ramp it up into a thing. And so the product existed first, and then funding came to produce a center to then support the product, which is how the Center for Open Science came to be, because they kind of built a support network around the product to kind of build up the open science framework. And that was in 2013, 2014. And since then, COS has grown into almost 50 people. We have a section of people who work on policy, so interacting with journals and institutions to look at how better to kind of increase transparency and openness in publishing. So one of the guidelines we put out recently is the top factor. So looking at kind of rating journals based on their policies of openness and transparency of the manuscripts that exist within them. We have a meta science division, which is what I'm part of, and we bring in right now millions of dollars in funding to do meta scientific research. We have our core network of computer scientists and back end and front end developers who build out both the OSF and preprints and pre-registration. So we've turned into a little engine that could. We're going up the hill and kind of building it all along. And we have over 200,000 registered users now on the OSF, and it's, as far as a PhD dissertation, it really is a huge sign of success, right? I think the joke is like, oh my God, someone read my dissertation, like how exciting. It's actually now there's now we're talking about COS, right? And we're talking about OSF, which is awesome. So yeah, it was kind of a beautiful, natural way that it kind of sprung up, and right at the right time too, right? 2012, 2013, in terms of the psychology credibility issues, the reproduction crisis, some people call it. It was really the right place, right time, right people were interested, and here we are.
Yeah, this sounds like a really nice story. So actually, just to bounce off what you just said, how much of OSF is really related to psychology versus to other scientific fields?
So we were definitely psychology first, right? And that comes based off of kind of the founders, right? So Brian, his background is in implicit bias and person perception. He's a kind of a classical psychologist. Jeffrey as well, a psychologist with interests in computer science and technology, right? So that's kind of the natural bridge. So at that time, in 2013, this was kind of the buildup of the replication crisis as we know it in psychology, which has been going on for about the last 10 years, ever since, there's so many to name, right? There's the BEM paper on precognition. There is the power posing failures to replicate. There is Diederik Stoppel in the Netherlands and the fraud case there. There's a lot of things that happened at the turn of 2010 into 2012, 2013 that really made psychologists in particular kind of question what the heck they were doing, So it was very psychology focused, but we're not a psychology focused organization. One of the big projects we're working on right now is a replication project in cancer biology, where we started off trying to do close replications of 20 cancer biology studies. And those papers have been published kind of one at a time in eLife. And there's going to be a big kind of overall project paper coming out soon, kind of looking at the overall replication. It's very hard to replicate things in other fields. Luckily, we have cancer biologists, so that works. But psychology is kind of an interesting place because, a lot of what they work on is easier to open up, right? So a lot of survey design and methodology, if you have the right permissions, you can share those. Those are Word documents, you can share them online. When you move into things like biology or physics, It's like, how do I share a cell line openly, right? How do I share a mouse line openly? And there are ways to do it, but it's a little more difficult than, well, I'm going to put it on a website. So we are branching into those areas, especially other social and behavioral sciences, sociology, economics, poli-sci. Those have more of an overlap with what we're able to offer in terms of sharing non-physical things. But we're definitely not just psychology only. It's just that we started there. And these issues about replicability aren't only in psychology as well. It's just kind of the first domino to fall. But from my own background in immunology, there are a lot of questionable practices that I'm sure influence the literature in ways that we probably don't want as a field of science. But yeah, so we're getting there.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So do you know of anything that was kind of very challenging in getting OSF to work the way it works now? Or
So, I mean, I think the challenges, I think there are technical challenges, but I think the bigger challenges are behavioral, right? I think trying to shift behavior is very hard. And usually when you're designing a product, right, if you think about tech entrepreneurs, usually something they think about is product market fit, right? Like, does my product fit the market? What we're trying to do is the opposite. We're trying to say, here's a product, can we shift the market to use it? And that's very hard because we're trying to say, okay, now you psychologists or you other social behavioral scientists, you're used to, running a study on, 30 to 45 undergraduates who are usually white, usually in the United States, or at least the global North, Western Europe, United States. They're 18 to 22, in psychology, they tend female, it's a very specific sample, which is a problem if you want to generalize outside of the college-aged, student population. So there are challenges there, right? There are challenges to say, okay, well, what I want you to do is really think about power, right? Think about, like, is it just convenience that you're running 45 students, or is the effect that you're actually trying to measure going to be measured with 45 students? Convincing people that it's okay to not be secretive about your work, right? So the idea of being scooped is a really big fear. And I get it, like, if you are working really hard on a grant, or you're working really hard to get tenure or to publish a dissertation paper, and someone comes in and they do it right before you, the way our system works, unfortunately, is that there's no way to really compensate for that. It's kind of like we have so much, and I say we as kind of science very broadly, we have this desire for novelty and for newness, right? And so being second to the party is might as well not even go, right? Is what some people think. And so pre-registration, which is where you say, here is my hypothesis, here's how I plan to test it, and then putting it out there and saying, here's the date I'm time stamping onto it of my plan being made, is challenging for people to sometimes do, because they'll say, well, what if someone looks at it, they have more funding, they have more people in their lab, and they can just do it faster than I can, and so working on shifting those behaviors and saying, no, actually what you're doing is you're putting a date on it and you're saying, here's what I'm working on. And for someone else to come in and do it, it's like almost like, here, I have a trademark, I have a patent on it. You're saying, here's my name, here's the date, here's my plan, and you can challenge it. And honestly, that really rarely happens, right? Like, now that we're seeing pre-registration out in the public and people have been doing it for years now, I think people are less cutthroat than maybe the image is, right? People aren't really out there looking to scoop. It's more like, hey, you're working on that, I am interested in that too, maybe we should work together on it. And so it actually is fostering collaboration and helping scientists actually, follow the scientific method that we were taught in fourth grade science class of, you hypothesize first, then you make your observations, and then you see if the observations either support or don't support the hypothesis you made. So shifting the behaviors have been kind of the really big challenge that thankfully we see scientists moving towards, which is great. The technical problems, they come and we solve them the best we can, and it's one of those things where it's like, all right, is this blocking the mission of helping increase transparency and openness and sharing of science? Yes, okay, we have to fix it. No, okay, well, we can fix it when we can, right? So it's really being mission focused in the technical aspect and really helping make those behavioral changes as easy as possible for as many people.
Okay. There's something I want to go back to in what you said
Sure.
about diversity, maybe not only of sample but also of researchers, and like
Mhm.
are kind of things that OSF or in general open science does for diversity in science overall.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a tool, it really lowers the barrier to bring people into projects, right? So I think another great thing, maybe great is too strong of a word. I'm going to just pivot a little bit. Uh, so Twitter for academia has been really interesting because, you know, at 20 years ago, 10 years ago, if I was a scientist at Rutgers, and I keep saying Rutgers because that's where I went, it would be very hard for me to find collaborators in other places. You know, I have some of my most diverse collaborations just as a scientist uh, from studies that kind of started on Twitter, which is very strange. So as a social angle, it's great. And then moving into OSF, that gives a platform that's kind of geographically independent, right? Everyone can kind of jump on and add their piece, which I think makes it very easy to have, non-institutional based collaborations, right? It's not just the labs that are down the hall in my department, but it's one person from the Netherlands, one person from Brazil, one person from Japan. And the great thing is, and this is just the internet, but OSF and your project is there 24/7. So when I go to bed, my collaborators are working on it. And then when I wake up, things are done. And then when they go to bed, I work on it. And so actually, being able to kind of harness global collaboration is really great for efficiency because there's always stuff going on. And this is not just OSF, but OSF is definitely a piece in the puzzle to kind of help facilitate those. The communication angle with other tools, definitely the data and project management with OSF, and there's a kind of a democracy to preprints where unfortunately, and again, this is just kind of science more broadly, the journals and the publishing tends to favor, the Western Europe and North America, global North scientific communities. And that's just true. And English speaking, and so being able to kind of break some of those barriers with preprints at least is a step forward in kind of harnessing all of the smart people all around the world, right? Like I have some of my best collaborations with people I know in Brazil, a lot of people I know in the Netherlands. There's an interesting meta science community in the Netherlands, which I've learned about, which is awesome, but kind of all over the place, and the OSF is definitely a tool to help centralize kind of the work that could just be, stuck in some person's lab, in the US.
That's kind of interesting to me that you use the word centralized, because I feel like centralization is something we tend to fear in general in open science, and that kind of goes against some of the ideas.
Mhm.
How do you feel? Because OSF is this kind of, I mean, I think amazing toolbox. I've been using it for, I think I've tried pretty much all the functions by now. Uh, so it's like awesome to have everything in the same place, but at the same time, there's this kind of trade-off with centralization, I guess.
Mhm.
So how do you feel about it? Do you think it's going to be a problem at some point, or?
That's a good question. So we're definitely not the only fish in the sea in terms of project management like this. Um, I mean, I see the pros and cons on both sides. I personally am in favor of it because, and this is outside of me being at COS, but um, in terms so I am not a very organized scientist, to be completely honest. And so, I've had lab notebooks, I've had, Jupyter notebooks online. Like I've tried a lot of stuff. And especially with collaborators, it's so easy to lose files and emails and, get a new work laptop and miss stuff and, oh, I had that hard drive, where is it? I left it in the lab. Like me personally, it's so much easier for me just to have it all in one place. I can see the downsides, where it becomes a it's like a crux, right? It's like, well, if something happens at the centralization point, then it's not just you, it's everyone that gets the short end of it. But I mean, that is also well known at COS. And so there are many plans that look at that. And I think the platform itself allows for decentralization, um, because there's no one right way to use it, right? And there's no one like correct way of managing a project. So like the way I think about it as a user is that I generate a project for kind of all things that exist for one kind of scientific idea. Other people may use it where it's like, all right, well, here is the one piece, and you can link to other things in OSF, right? So it's like, all right, well, I'm going to store all my things in my Google Drive, and then I can link the Google Drive to the OSF project. Or like, I'm going to write the manuscript in Word and keep it in my Dropbox, then you can link that to the OSF project as well. So if there is an issue of like, well, I don't want to keep all my things in one place because if something happens to that place, there it goes. There are both technical pieces in mind to allow you to distribute, from like a data security angle or like data backup angle. And there's also guidelines in place for, well, what would happen if tomorrow the COS lost all funding? What would happen to everyone, all the 200,000 users, profiles, and data and stuff? We have fail-safes in place going many decades from now to ensure that nothing would happen. So both on a technical side and a policy side, as an organization, we're aware of the issues of centralization, but also make avenues available to kind of decentralize as well. So we're trying to play both sides.
Yeah, so sounds like a pretty good strategy to me. Okay, so maybe one last thing I'd like to talk about is when you talk about this general behavioral change, I guess it comes also a lot with like incentives and what's the general scientific ecosystem we're working with and which kind of constraints we have as scientists. So are there kind of more concrete actions that OSF or COS are taking to get some change there?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's definitely an area where, we as a scientific community have to be very careful, right? We've definitely seen recently, so in the kind of wake of the replication crisis in psychology, a lot of early tenure scientists, graduate students, postdocs, assistant professors, have really taken up the cause, right? Have really been like, this is better. If we think about science as a set of ideals, this follows those ideals more closely than kind of the business of science, pre 2010, where it's like, I publish X amount of papers in the top tier journals, and this number means I can get tenure, right? That's kind of antithetical to what science should be, right? Which is the exploration of the world and trying to observe truth, right? At least that's what I think. But the problem is when the younger scientists, the non-tenured scientists pick this up, there is a higher burden, right? It's like, all right, well, there is a non-zero risk of scooping, right? We talked about how that risk is actually not realized, but it is non-zero. It is more work to pre-register, right? You have to really think about the work you're doing ahead of time and really crystallize everything you want to do before you ever start, right? So there are higher startup costs. And at the end of the day, if those things aren't appreciated, the scientist who spent their time planning and organizing and sharing maybe 2 papers behind the person who said, you know what, I'm going to follow the business of science from the 90s and publish, 6 papers in top tier journals. And there's my Nature paper, there's my Science paper. Okay, please give me tenure. So there is this double-sided, it's a two-sided blade, right? Whatever the saying is, where they're doing more and potentially getting less. And so we definitely want to avoid that situation. Some of the things that we're doing, and this goes to the policy angle of COS, is that we're working very closely with journals to increase, their adoption of some of these policies, right? So one of the earliest things was the badge system, right? So there's like the open data badge, the open materials badge, and the pre-registration badge. And journals have started to pick this up and labeling papers with, okay, is the data available? This paper gets a gold star, right? Are the materials available? It gets a blue star. Is it pre-registered? It gets a red star. And so psychology has shown that even these type of signals show a benefit, right? If you're looking at two papers and one has 3 badges and one has no badges, then the viewer will judge those differently, right? So you're actually getting a little bit of a benefit to kind of being open, and the journal gets a benefit because they can say, look, we're being open. And so we are seeing a shift there. It's very slow, and it's very journal by journal. Outside of COS, there's growing support of registered reports, and the registered report format, is an amazing format. And this is a format where scientists or manuscript authors, they write up the introduction and the methods of a paper, and that gets reviewed prior to data collection. And then after review, that paper can get a tentative publication approval, independent of data, which is amazing. The scientist then collects the data based off of what was reviewed. There's a secondary review to say, okay, did you collect the data and did you analyze it based off of what your methods were that we reviewed? It's usually pretty straightforward at phase 2. Then that gets published independent of, a p less than 0.05 or Bayes factor over 3, or whatever that signal of statistical significance is, which has been a barrier for so long. So that is something kind of outside of COS that's going on. We're working very closely with the journals inside COS to kind of help both with the badge system, with the top factor guidelines, to help encourage these behaviors that scientists have picked up first, and now we're working on journals, and after that it's going to be institutions, and it's kind of a tidal shift all the way through the system. So yeah, we're working on it because it is. You're right. There's a possibility where those in the most vulnerable positions in our scientific system take on the most burden, and that's troubling because we want those scientists to succeed, right? And not have them select out, because then we don't see change, right? You only see change of the people who leave, and then the system is the same. So it's definitely something that we're attuned to and that we're working on. The scientific system as it exists is a very big, complex thing, right? I know complexity. It's a very complex thing. So it moves slowly, but it's moving. It is a very positive way of looking at it.
So is there a reason you're going for journals first and institution next, or is it just easier to change journals than institutions?
So I think it comes to kind of the way that the current scientific system works, right? And it's kind of a branch off, right? So it's kind of like observations happen, observations are analyzed, and then that has to go somewhere. And I think, the journal publishing system is like 350 years old, right? I think 1650s, 1670s were the first scientific journals in France and the UK, in England at the time, UK, whatever. So I mean, it's a really old system. So like scientists for generations, this is kind of the step, right? You collect your data, you analyze your data, you write it up, you publish it. And so I think it's about kind of working through that system where it's like, okay, well, hypothesis moment, we are working on making more transparent with pre-registration. Data collection, we're making more transparent by allowing the sharing of data. Manuscript writing, we're allowing more transparency with preprints. And so kind of the next step in that are journals. And so we're going there. And at the institution level, I mean, there are a lot of other ways that institutions can be a part of it. And we're working on those as well. I don't think it's first journals, then that. It's kind of both at the same time. But the journals, I think it's a little easier to see movement in, because we can say, okay, well, the first baby step is just offer these badges, and then if the authors come to you with things you can give badges to, give badges. And then you can say, oh, well, you've done that. Well, maybe if they say that they have open data, maybe you request to see the open data during the review process so you can confirm that this is true. And then it's like, oh, they have open data and code, then maybe there should be an analysis review during manuscript review, right? So it's kind of one step at a time, piece by piece, and it's cyclical, right? The institutions see that scientists and journals are doing it, and they say, oh, well, maybe we should, request these of our job candidates, when they come in for a job talk. Maybe we should ask about, their record of data sharing. Maybe we should see their OSF project, or, where else they share their data. And, so it is, because then, those publications wind up on CVs. CVs then wind up in the hands of hiring committees or tenure committees. And so they start to shift along with the journals and the scientists as well. So again, right, if you're making all the change at the early career level and that's not being selected for in the hiring and tenure levels, well, then what change is happening? So seeing it in the journals, at least the journals, there's always a record of that. So 30 years later, you can say, yes, this scientist who is now working in the private sector, we can see that they shared their stuff and we can go review it, right? So that shift is happening. And I think it's happening at the same time, both at the journal institution level. So we're getting there. I'm very optimistic. I don't know if you can tell, but
I can't. No, but that's really good. I mean, it's kind of nice thinking there's a bright future ahead for all of that.
I like to think so. Yeah.
um, okay. Yeah, I just wanted also to bounce back a bit more on like pre-registration and how do you adjust for epistemic diversity and just, kind of which discipline you come from. Because I feel like that might have been one of the practice that is kind of less clear how to incorporate for certain types of works. And in particular, in complexity science, we have a lot of people work just with models. So for them, it's like, am I supposed to just tell about what kind of ideas I'm going to try to model, or does it make any sense even for them to try to pre-register? So I think, I have a general question about how do you accommodate this kind of epistemic diversity and disciplinary diversity?
Yeah, so that is an ongoing process because you're right. Like so many different fields have so many different like specific needs and wants that, one form, one idea doesn't cut it. And this is where going back, right? We definitely started in psychology. So we can say, okay, well, what is the psychological method of doing this? And let's work on that. In the last couple of years, we've been branching out. And a lot of this comes down to, who can we collaborate with, right? What fields can we collaborate with? So in the last couple of years, we've started working on like a secondary data analysis pre-registration. So this is something where, the data already exists and you're going to do an analysis. So it's not about how you collect the data, but it's about, how do you sample a certain amount of the data to build your analysis off of, how do you pre-register the analysis and then with the full data set, right, kind of like a test and learn system, with the full data set, then run that analysis and look at the outcome. Something that is really interesting is that, in the projects that I'm working on right now, we're looking across other socio-behavioral fields and fields like political science, their behaviors have been kind of much more open compared to psychology. So if you look at poli-sci papers from 2010, they already have data being shared because that was just a norm in their field, right? They call it replication. I would call it reproduction, but it's the same thing. Your data that you're using to support your findings are shared and available at the journal. And you can just click a link for the supplementary materials and you get a zip file full of the data, which is awesome, right? So there are huge differences between fields. And a lot of it just comes down to when is the field ready to think about it? And then, it's something that, because we're not the owners of pre-registration, right? Pre-registration is an idea that I think, can exist in multiple places across multiple systems. And I think once the field's ready to say, yeah, this is an issue, maybe we should think about how we're going to do it, and then if support's needed on kind of the technical end or, as a thought partner, like COS is there. We have experience in some fields. And so we can say, well, one of the things that we're trying to address is researcher degrees of freedom, right? So if you're developing a model, maybe what you don't want to do is say, okay, here's the model, here's the outcome. Well, I was really expecting, something else. Well, maybe I have to change the shape of the model a bit, right? So you want to, and maybe that's not, maybe you want to be more exploratory, right? So the idea then would say, okay, well, here's my starting model, right? If expectations are correct, there may be X amount of changes to that model, to see kind of what the hypothetical outcome would be. As you can tell, I'm not a modeler, right? So I'm speaking probably like baby language, but that's okay. The idea is really, what are you trying to solve, right? So for psychologists, it was, we have so many people who hypothesize after the results are known, who Andrew Gelman would call, walk through the garden of forking paths, right? And so as hypothesis testers, right, in kind of the NHST, null hypothesis significance testing universe, we want to keep that to a minimum. And so when we thought about pre-registration, it was like, all right, how do we kind of bind our hands to say, we're only going to test for these things? Now, for modeling, that might be a little different, right? In modeling, there might be other concerns that need to be addressed. And so that idea of pre-registration would then change. Something that I'll have to put out there because we're recording. So something I try to say in all my talks is that pre-registration is a plan, not a prison, right? So it's like, you want to just ahead of time say, what's the plan that I'm going to follow, right? And there's no like, oh my God, that's too much. That's not considered a pre-registration. You know, it's really just about taking the time at the beginning of the process to kind of think about what those steps are going to be. You know, what changes will be allowed, what changes will not be allowed. And then even if you do those changes that are not allowed, it comes down to being transparent at the end, saying, okay, well, I pre-registered this path. It winds up that halfway through, we had to actually shift gears and take this path. And so that wasn't pre-registered. And here's the reason why we had to change. And that's all it is. You know, it's not like, oh my God, I cannot go do that. It's about saying, okay, this is what I thought of ahead of time. This is what happened during the process. And here's why a change was needed. And so the goal, you know, from our side is transparency and kind of making thoughtful decisions and thinking through the process. And so that can take any number of shapes, and that is completely malleable to any field that is at the point to say, yeah, this is something we should prioritize.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. Yeah, that also matches my own experience with pre-registration, to be honest.
Yeah.
And yeah, this kind of thing where different fields get to different places about open science at different paces also
Mm-hmm.
definitely resonates. Like I mean, I grew up in a cognitive science department,
Yeah.
um, and there, like, preprints are kind of considered kind of newish and still open science. And then
Mm-hmm.
I moved to SFI, which is complexity science, so a lot more art science, where preprints have been around for ages and are just normal
Yeah.
part of doing
Yep.
science.
Yep.
So do you think we can hope for a future where like a lot of open science practice just end up being scientific practices, kind of without this accent on openness, being something
Yeah.
specific about it?
Yeah, I definitely think, yeah, the open science, you know, moniker is definitely just to compare against what has been observed, at least in the social behavioral sciences. Because you're right, like my in-laws are astrophysicists and they've used arXiv for years. And they're like, wait a minute, you don't do this? Or wait a minute, you don't have papers with 75 authors, right? These kind of large scale collaborations, this it's all very new in certain fields. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, physicists, what is their open science, right? It's like again, I'm not a physicist, so any physicist listening, you know, they're going to strike me down when they hear it. But it's like, you know, it might be every few weeks they're updating, you know, a white paper or something, saying, okay, well, this is what we worked on, and this is what we're going to work on, and it's just like an iterative process. And I think we'll get there, you know, and I think some fields will always be in a certain place compared to other fields, but I think it's about raising that baseline, right? It's about saying, okay, well, it's commonplace everywhere to preprint. That would be awesome, right? It's commonplace everywhere to kind of put your scientific plan out there somewhere with a date, right? And maybe the specifics come down to fields, right? So modelers might have a certain preference and psychologists have a certain preference, but the idea that, yeah, well, when I start a project, I put out my goals and I put out my methods. Cool. At the end of a project, as I'm getting ready to publish it, I preprint it. I mean, some places are looking at the idea of post-publication review, which is kind of like taking a preprint and then adding peer reviewers to it, and then allowing the editing process, right? So there are innovations happening kind of all over the spectrum of the scientific kind of workflow. And so, yeah, I think raising the bar, not raising the bar, lifting the tide is probably gonna happen. But I also think maybe as that happens, you know, what the definition of open science will change, right? So now once everyone preprints and once everyone pre-registers, it's like, okay, well, have you considered registered reports, you know, or have you considered, you know, using like running your analyses on dummy data right first, and actually having an analysis workflow that you then pre-register, because that's still something that's a little new in psychology, is like, okay, Well, consider the structure of your data, right, before you actually collect it, and then make, artificial data, make a simulated data set, write your analysis plan, pre-register that, and then collect the data. That's still a little complex. And some people are doing it, and that's awesome. I haven't got to that point in my own personal work. I would love to. And so, like, as norms change, I think what that focus of open science may change as well. And so, what we currently consider open science will just be science. And then the open science will be that more transparent kind of utopia that we see off in the distance. And, the Overton window shifts ever so slightly towards that. So yeah, I think what we currently consider open science will change, and what we currently consider science will become more what we think is open. Um, and again, it'll be field dependent for sure, because yeah, the physicists are sitting there waiting for us. They're waiting for the social behavioral scientists. And all right, you got the preprints down. All right, now let's keep going. So we'll get there.
Okay, that feels like a very nice and optimistic point to kind of stop. So
Yeah.
if there's anything else you want to add, I think that's a good time to do it.
Yeah, I would just suggest, if you're new to the open science stuff, check out osf.io. It's free to sign up. Everything for the scientists is completely free. Making projects, sharing your data, pre-printing materials, all of that's completely free. Totally try to use it if you'd like. Um, and yeah, I mean, it was great talking to you.
Same. Thanks again for taking the time
Of
to be
course.
with us and explaining us all of those things.